Without further ado, we're going to go into our 101. This would be our landscape carbon kind of TED Talk, and they have Ellen Humphreys and Andrew Tanentzap here from Trent and Carleton universities, respectively.
And then the first set of slides are for Andrew. So I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Carleton University, and I'm a carbon cycle scientist and really pleased to be here, and we can go to the workshop. So I'll let Andrew keep it going.
So my flight, I was on with some of you. I got in at 2 a.m., so I may not seem as excited as I usually am about all this. So my name is Andrew Tanentzap. I run the Ecosystems of Global Change research group. We're spread out in 3 places worldwide. So the group was originally founded at the University of Cambridge in England in 2013. These are most of the people in the Cambridge group at the moment. A couple of years ago, I took up a Canada research chair at Trent University in Ontario. And then just last year, we opened our 3rd branch at the Institute for Chemistry and Biology of the Marine Environment in Germany. So thank you very much for letting us come here and speak and share expertise and knowledge with you. So carbon. We live on a carbon-based planet. Carbon is everywhere. It's in the rocks. It's in nature. It comes out of our breath. It's in our makeup. And if we look at where carbon is found on the planet, so this is a global overview of where we find carbon. Most of it is in the ocean. And most of this carbon in the ocean is very stable. So what that means is that it's not necessarily going to end up in the atmosphere as a source of carbon dioxide or methane that drives climate change. Now, aside from in the ocean, we have a lot of carbon in soils and permafrost and in vegetation. Not so much in the NWT because we don't have tall trees here. So most of the carbon in the NWT will be found in permafrost and in soils. And really, one of the key uncertainties scientifically, and even from a policy perspective, is that you can see there's a lot of carbon in the ocean. So how does it get there? Well, it moves from land into the ocean. And along the way, a lot of that carbon, we think it gets set back up to the atmosphere, but we don't have a really good sense of how much. And so what happens to carbon in rivers and lakes on its way to the deep sea is a big uncertainty in the global carbon cycle. Now, the other point I want to make here is that you can see up here the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And maybe you can't see the numbers in the back, but there's about 3 to 4 times more carbon in soil than in the atmosphere. So what that means is that a very small change to the amount of carbon in soil can have a big impact on the atmosphere. Okay, so that's I've got 3 sort of messages that I'd like everyone to take away, and this is one of them. Okay, so I was going to talk much better about all of this, but if we look at where carbon is found in the NWT, this is a map here of carbon stores in Canada. The size of the sort of the mountains here reflect the amount of carbon in the land, and what you can see is that the NWT, specifically down here, is very rich in carbon. Okay, we know this, but we don't really have very good estimates of how much carbon there is. And like the Deputy Minister said, the NWT is a very important carbon store nationally and also globally. So what happens in the NWT matters for the whole planet. Okay, now I want to talk a bit about carbon, because I sort of alluded to it when I started off talking, but when we think of carbon, I'd say it's most scientists even do this. They approach carbon, it's like looking through a keyhole. We think of carbon as this single uniform thing, the single element. carbon. And all of the research we do in my research group is about widening this key vault to see carbon in all of its different forms and all the different functions that these forms carry. So what this means is that invisible to our eyes, at a microscopic level, carbon is 20, 30, 100,000 different types of molecules. And all of those molecules have different form, and because of that, they have different function. So they interact with the environment in different ways. And to zoom out a bit on that, you might think, okay, soil carbon might be very different from carbon in vegetation. And even in vegetation, carbon is very different. So this is a great example. Some of you are drinking tea here this morning, and you can see that we can put the exact same amount of carbon in each of our mugs. And yet, the properties of that carbon, how it tastes, how it smells, how it looks, is very different. And that's all driven by what happens at that molecular level that we can't see. So that's the second point I want to make, is that at a molecular level, the form of that carbon determines if it stays in the ground, if it goes back to the atmosphere. So that is really important to think about. The last point I want to make is that if we want to think about keeping carbon on the land, and tracking how carbon is changing on the land in response to different interventions like we might implement for policy management, it's not enough just to track what the carbon is doing. And so this is an example I'll walk you through. So imagine we have time here, and we have the amount of carbon on the land on this vertical plane here. And so you can see here that over time, carbon is increasing. Now, if we were to implement a project, let's say to try and protect a specific type of habitat, and over that course of that project, we would measure what's happening to the carbon in that project, we can't actually tell if that project is working or not. And what I mean by that is to be able to do that, so this dotted line up here, imagine this is what happens in the project, this is what happens in the area of peatland we protect. What we need are sort of the baseline scenarios to try and contextualize those changes, these what-if scenarios. So to actually understand how effective our policy is, we need to understand what is happening without that policy. And Alison has done a brilliant job capturing this idea of additionality in the handout. And I just have one more. How am I doing on time? Yeah, I'm okay. Okay. I just have one more example that I really want to hammer home this point of how important this is to do. So this is some work we did a few years ago, thinking about biodiversity, and what this shows here is, again, on the vertical here, we have the percent of habitat area that's remaining from the start and finish of this project. And so you can see that the habitat that's remaining has declined by 40%. Has this project failed? We've lost half of the habitat in this project. Well, my point is we can't actually answer that question without knowing what is happening in the background on the land without that project. So imagine that we didn't implement this policy. What we might have discovered was that we would have gone from 80% of this habitat to 10%. So actually, the intervention, even though the amount of habitat actually decreased on the landscape, the intervention made a difference. The policy was successful. Okay? And so this is, again, this idea of additionality, which is the difference between what would happen without our policy and the policy. So it's really important when we're thinking about how to track what's happening to carbon on the landscape, that we set up a way to track what would happen without the interventions that we might implement to be able to accurately assess if what we are doing is really making a difference. So thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Ella.
Okay, thanks. So, coming back to this map, this is a pretty famous map. Is showing the amount of soil carbon circumpolar with the North Pole there in the center. And what you can see is these different colors of brown. So dark brown shows high concentrations of carbon in the ground. So up to 50 to 100 kilograms of carbon per every square meter. And notice some terminology on the left there. We've got the terms stocks, stores, reservoirs, and pools. They all are slightly different, but they're all also equivalent in many respects. So if we're talking about a soil carbon stock or a soil carbon store or a reservoir, we're just talking about somewhere where that soil carbon is. And so again, we've already heard this 3 times now. There are vast stocks of carbon in the Northwest Territories. And oh no, this is an older version, I guess. The intro doesn't show up, but I had drawn a box around NWT, but you know where it is. You would have heard many of you, so that's all good. And you can see that there is a dark band along the Mackenzie Valley, and that's where you have really high concentrations of soil carbon. This soil carbon is associated with wetlands and permafrost-affected soils, and we'll talk about how that got there. So first of all, though, how do we know where the carbon is? Well, scientists, different government folks have gone out there, dug up the soil, they dig it with their hands, they dig it with backhoes, they dig it with augers, especially when it's frozen. You need some gas car behind you to do this. And then you take those samples and bring them to the lab and you analyze them. And then you can just sum it up. You calculate it and get the total amount of carbon per meter square. And you'll see here on this map that the blue dots are measurements that this one research group put together to map the soil carbon in Canada. And you'll notice that in the northern environments, there's far fewer blue dots compared to southern regions. So there is uncertainty. The fewer blue dots you have, the less you know, but you still have lots of blue dots. So we are doing okay. So once you have all those individual measurements, you can then map it to the larger region. And there's a lot of different ways so that you can spread those measurements out on a map. And so you can associate them with different types of soil. And that's what we see on the right, the left. Is classifying soil polygons. And so that's where those individual blue dots have been spread out based on soil type. And then here on this side, we have a machine learning. So it's again where you take all those individual blue dots, put it into a computer model with lots of other variables or properties that can be measured on the landscape or by satellite. And this computer model spits out the answer and spreads out those blue dots onto the back. So there's 2 different versions there, but they more or less agree. Now, we also heard that carbon is in plants. There's far less carbon in the WT in the above ground biomass, the plant biomass, but it's still there. This map here shows the forest carbon. So you'll see that it goes gray above tree line. It doesn't mean there isn't any carbon above tree line. It just means that it would be in a different category. So this is forest carbon. You can see that the colors here, the blues and cyan colors show about 1 to 3 kilograms of carbon per meter square. That's a lot less than 50 to 100, which we saw in the soil. So again, you're seeing that repeat information that there's less carbon above ground than there is below ground, particularly in the NWT. And so in this case here, how do we map out the gray color? Well, we have measurements. Again, people go out, measure the plant material. They turn that into measures of carbon, and again, can map it the same way, computers and other methods. Okay, so how did that carbon get here? Well, carbon, again, you've heard this, carbon flows in and out of the landscape in different ways. So the soil carbon has accumulated over millennia as carbon comes in by the plants growing, plant material dies, it's incorporated into wet soils or cold soils, and then it can be preserved because the microbes that decompose that plant material are doing a whole lot when they're frozen or very wet. And so those natural flows in to the ecosystem, there's my green arrow, is from plant growth. photosynthesis. And again, the plant material gets incorporated into the soil when it dies. And then some of that material leaves the landscape as respiration, decomposition, and combustion. So when the microbes are respiring, when the plants are respiring, they're releasing carbon dioxide as they break down that that organic matter. Decomposition, again, is basically microbial respiration, where the microbes are breaking down that material. It's being released back out to the atmosphere. And then combustion is, as you know, fires. That is, again, just burning material, sent it back out to the atmosphere. In addition to losing carbon to the atmosphere, you can lose carbon out to the oceans. And Andrew already nicely described that some of that material is getting into the waterways and making its way out eventually to the ocean. And as it makes its way out to the ocean, it can be turned over, decomposed, and sent back into the atmosphere as well. So to estimate carbon flows, or otherwise known as fluxes, you can measure using bottom-up methods and top-down methods. So another set of terminology. And before we leave that terminology, we also have the term sinks and sources. So just a really preview, a sink would be a stock or a pool or a reservoir that takes in more carbon than it loses, and a source would lose more than it gains. Okay, so bottom-up estimate of these carbon flows or carbon fluxes often is based on field measurements. So this is where we gain on-the-ground measurements using techniques called eddy covariance, for example. Allison's drawn a really nice image. This is the kind of research I do, so I like to talk about this a lot. But this is where you directly measure carbon in the atmosphere and how it's moving between the surface and the sky. And so here I've got a little diagram showing little carbon dioxide molecules and little methane molecules, and we measure that with basically a fancy weather station. We can also use chamber measurements, which is my students here on the right in their full bug gear, measuring how much carbon dioxide and methane get accumulated in those little containers. And then we take those measurements and analyze them in the lab. And you can also just directly measure the change in carbon stocks over time. Dig up that soil now, dig it up again later, and measure how much has changed. Bottom-up estimates like those can be used to dry mapped products. And so you could find these online. There's lots of databases that essentially spread out these mapped products over the globe. You can then use them to drive process-based computer models. So the computer models use the relationships between those flows or fluxes and things like temperature or the amount of plants on the surface. And they become equations that can predict the flows or simulate the flows. And they can also make predictions into the future if you give it a climate change scenario, for example. Top-down estimates come out from the other way. They measure the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this little GIF that's really distracting, but also kind of neat, it's showing you this couple summer months and the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So cooler colors show a decrease in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so in summer months, plants are photosynthesizing, taking out that carbon dioxide, and so that concentration is going down in the atmosphere. And so then these inversion models, a top-down method, take those concentrations and back out where the landscape is taking up that carbon or releasing it. Okay, so measuring and modeling those carbon stocks and those carbon flows in and out of the landscape is very important to, do things like additionality, like Andrew was talking about. It can help us understand factors that can control carbon flows, all those things about warming, permafrost thaw, erosion, fire, can help us understand why some of these stocks are more vulnerable to disturbance and climate change than others. And again, it can help us understand possibilities for enhancing carbon stocks. And so that is it for me.
Okay, we have the time for questions before we move on. So I'll just open the floor. And if there's anyone who had a question online, you can just raise your hand and then Ahmed will let me know and we'll give you a question to unmute yourself. So if anyone has a question, raise your hand. Dan, no.
Also, I have tour my day 1 AM micros on my community.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm wondering what is the actual policy options for achieving additionality in the Northwest Territories? In most of these areas, um, what do you actually do to prevent that kind of excessive release of carbon? Like, what are the concrete policy options for doing that? I see in the paper here that it looks like preventing forest fires is one of them. Is that something that is on the table, or are there other things that realistically people could do?
Who is the deputy bench?
We're just going to say that I think to a certain extent, that's what we're here to discuss. And you're going to be hearing about a variety of different folks, research methods, research gaps, but also policy options, particularly day 2 and 3, to help us understand what is possible and what is most well suited to the Northwest Territories. I don't know if you guys have something to add to that.
Yeah, that's what I was about to speak into my wonders. All right. Yeah, I was going to say, that's a great question, really important, and you kind of have had already an answer to it. So I think we're going to hear tomorrow about the nature-based solutions. So that's a way to sort of enhance how nature is working to keep carbon in the land. For example, trying to limit forest fires and building the resilience of forests and in places where there are forests. So tomorrow we're going to hear all about nature-based solutions, and I think there are quite a number of people around here that can probably talk about that a lot better than I can. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, hopefully tomorrow.
Hopefully tomorrow. And you some of the answer. I know, way to start the questions with a banger. So I've got one here, and then I'll go to you, Stan. Okay. Hi. Thanks for the presentation. Natalie, how much you just gave us your name and a bit for your work?
I'm Victoria Goodday with Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada. Thanks for the presentations. I have a question about top-down versus bottom-up ways of estimating GHGs or carbon fluxes. Which is more accurate right now, or do they work in tandem? What are your thoughts on which one, like, for example, a policy should be based on?
They work in tandem. So yeah, we like to use all of these methods to, again, more or less zoom in on truth as much as we possibly can, right? So again, you bring all the tools to your disposal.
Okay, it looks like Stan doesn't have a question. His or does. Oh, and then I've got over here.
Yeah, just thanks for the presentation. Just a quick question about... Khizr Tajammul GNWT ECC. Quick question about eddy covariance towers. How many do we need to get a sense of the carbon coming out of the ground, going into the ground across NWT?
How many do we need? And then often people ask, how long do they need to be there? As many as possible. No, you do want to, you want to represent certain ecosystems as much as possible so that you have a sense of what the tundra is doing versus a forest, versus a peatland, versus maybe even a lake. And so you need those measurements on those different ecosystem types. But then you also need the representation of the climate. So are you in the north? Are you in a continental region? Are you near the ocean? So those representations are important too. We've got some colleagues who will speak here at it later that will show the importance of kind of hitting spots that aren't represented anywhere else so that we can fill in gaps and better map, essentially, what is going on in terms of these flows. Yeah. So more is good. Yes. It definitely reduces uncertainty, but there is you can do it with a lot of good science behind it to pick those spots that'll really help fill in gaps.
I'm hearing one for each land classification.
Yes and no. Yeah. Like, again, it depends on a lot of things as well as like surface geology and climate and perhaps the disturbances that are affecting a certain region. You might want to, focus on regions like that, for example.
Yeah, we've got one over here. And also just a reminder, please don't speak for those of us here, if you speak without a mic, we can hear you, but we do have quite a few people online. And so if you speak without a mic, they can't hear the question.
Yeah, I'm Ms. Bahul Alam, Senior Community Planner at Municipal and Community Affairs, GNWT. My question may sound very basic and silly, but I just wanted to confirm. As we saw in the slides, that carbon is everywhere. So we can see we learned that. And then you have shown us a diagram which shows carbon is going to the ocean like this. And then somewhere it is trapped and somewhere it is there. So my question is, all this carbon is not actually harmful. So the only harm, where it interacts, like when it goes to the air, it becomes harmful. So the only thing that we have to think about is a basic thing that we don't have to, like they have policies and they have projects, we just take care of it. I just wanted to confirm that. Yeah, that's a basic thing.
Yes, absolutely. And we didn't focus in on climate change processes in our little 101, but that is exactly it. Carbon dioxide, methane, these are greenhouse gases. And when they're in the atmosphere, they enhance warming of the climate.
Thank you.
I'll just add one thing to that is that, even the type of greenhouse gas that goes back, so carbon dioxide and methane have very different effects on heating the planet. So conservative estimate is that methane has 25 times the effect of the same amount of carbon dioxide. So it's about, exactly like you said, preventing the carbon to go into the atmosphere, but carbon dioxide has a very different effect from methane. Methane's a lot worse to get back to the atmosphere. And so thinking about the habitats where you have places on the landscape where you have methane and trying to, maybe that might be prioritized. That's an important distinction to think about.
Great. I've got one over here and then one at the back.
Thank you. My name is Leonardo Conde. I work for relevant and infrastructure here at the GWT. My question is for you, Andrew, regarding your past slides when you were talking about the carbon cycle, about then considering that we should be concerned about, yes, the carbon that is moving into the atmosphere because of climate change, but also the carbon that it's accumulated in the oceans because it causes the ocean acidification. Right. It depends on the type of, depending on the type of carbon, but yeah, it's kind of big. There is a Colbert mentions that it's and it will treat to climate change, right? Ocean acidification because of the processes that it tells. But mostly my question is about when you mentioned this uncertainty in terms of how the carbon moves from the soil that it's trapped there into the oceans, the atmosphere, which are the elements that you think contribute to this level of uncertainty? We're talking about maybe the feedback loops add to this process, or which variables do you think that are not sufficiently being explored in order to understand this process?
So I think, and I hope that's a fair thing to say, that we have very poor estimates of how much carbon moves from land into the ocean and how reactive that is. So my point was, right, we see a lot of carbon in the ocean. How does it get there? Most of it's coming from land over hundreds of years, millennia, building up. But then we see a lot less than what we would probably expect to be, or what we can estimate would be exported from land. So we don't really have a good sense, I would say, globally at how much of that carbon is actually lost along that transport. So I think that's sort of what you were framing, right?
Yeah, I was trying to understand more the research that it probably don't need. It's possible to see like maybe where are those gaps that could explain that absence of understanding around the specific process or the carbon that it's missing. I think that's not my.
I'm going to suggest that you two discuss that during the break. And I'm going to go to Peter and then we'll move on.
Hi, everybody. Peter Borst. This is just a very quick comment. I'm going to point you out. I can't remember your name, but the reason why I'm pointing you out is there aren't any silly questions here. I came here for the 3 days because I've got a lot to learn. All of us, if one person has a question, more people have the same question. So if you have one, please raise your questions because we're here. We can be walking away saying, I don't understand. We need to go move forward. So thanks for your question.
Okay, for that, I see someone who's now not afraid or maybe less shy to ask their question. So I'm going to ask the mic over there and then we're move on. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Anton from Université de Montréal and Mila. I have a question about the temporal resolution that would be needed to actually get a better understanding of those exchanges, because you're showing like very different processes that can lead to carbon being released into the atmosphere. What would be like your ideal?
Yeah, there's processes that work on like seconds, right? And then there's other processes that are hundreds of years long that impact carbon cycles. So ideally, we measure them all the time, and but the more we understand about all these different scales, the better we can do in our models, in our predictions, our estimates. So that's kind of a wishy-washy answer, but hopefully that it basically because I'm a person who measures carbon fluxes on the landscape with eddy covariance, like in this graph here, we want to be there for at least 5 to 25 to 30 years. Maybe that's just because that's sort of the the lifetime of a research scientist's career. But also it ties in with the climate change signals. We want to see decadal change. If we can measure decadal change, we can better understand what's driving it.